his hand clamped around her arm hard enough to bruise. Staff Sergeant Brennan's face flushed red with authority as he yanked the Recon Marine toward him, not noticing how 3 Navy SEALs across the compound had frozen mid-conversation. Before we dive into this confrontation, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from, because maybe you've seen someone make a mistake they couldn't take back. The equipment yard stretched across the forward operating base under the afternoon sun, dust hanging in the air from a convoy that had rolled through minutes earlier. Brennan had spotted her near the communications bunker, a location he decided was restricted despite having no actual authority over access protocols. She'd been walking with purpose, tablet in hand, Marine Corps utility uniform marking her as standard reconnaissance personnel. Nothing about her demeanor suggested she expected confrontation, which made Brennan's decision to physically intervene that much more aggressive. The grip tightened as he pulled her away from the bunker entrance. "You think you can just wander into secure areas?" His voice carried across the yard, loud enough to draw attention from Marines loading equipment nearby. She turned to face him with an expression that registered the contact without reacting to it, her body language shifting to accommodate the force without resisting. "Sir, I have authorization to be here." Her tone stayed level, professional, the kind of calm that should have signaled something to anyone paying attention. Across the compound, near a parked Humvee, Petty Officer Rodriguez lowered the water bottle he'd been drinking from and exchanged glances with the 2 SEALs beside him. Mills stepped forward instinctively before Rodriguez caught his arm and shook his head once. Chin already had his phone out, camera pointed toward the confrontation, his jaw tight. The 3 operators knew exactly who Brennan had grabbed, and they understood the scope of his mistake in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. Brennan's confidence swelled as other Marines gathered within viewing distance, some watching with curiosity, others with the uncomfortable awareness that something felt wrong about the physical nature of his detention. "Authorization? Show me your paperwork right now." He released her arm only to jab a finger toward her chest, close enough to be threatening without making contact. She stepped back precisely 1 pace, creating distance while maintaining eye contact. The movement was economical, trained, nothing wasted. "My authorization goes through channels above base command, sir. I can verify through the appropriate office." That answer triggered exactly the response she likely anticipated. Brennan's face darkened further as he interpreted her words as evasion rather than truth. "Above base command?" He laughed, the sound harsh and performative for the growing audience. "You're a corporal. Nothing you do goes above this base commander." He moved closer again, invading her space with the bulk of his frame, using his size as intimidation. She didn't retreat this time, just stood there absorbing his aggression with a stillness that seemed to frustrate him more than resistance would have. Rodriguez watched the exchange unfold with increasing tension in his shoulders, his hands flexing unconsciously. Mills muttered something about intervening, but Rodriguez stopped him again with a quiet word. "Let it play out. She's got this." His confidence in that assessment came from 6 years of working operations alongside the woman Brennan was manhandling, 6 years of watching her handle worse situations than an angry staff sergeant with an authority complex. Chun kept recording, capturing every moment of physical contact, every threatening gesture, building a documentation trail that Rodriguez knew would matter soon. The Marines nearby shifted their weight, some clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but uncertain about challenging a senior NCO in the middle of what appeared to be a disciplinary action. One Lance Corporal took a step forward before his companion pulled him back with a sharp whisper. The power dynamic looked clear to anyone without context. Large male staff sergeant exerting physical authority over smaller female Marine who appeared to be in the wrong place. The appearance of the situation was exactly what made Brennan's mistake so catastrophic. She made one more attempt at de-escalation, her voice still carrying that professional calm. "Sir, I can contact the operations officer to verify my authorization. That would resolve this situation quickly." The offer was reasonable, the kind of suggestion that should have given Brennan pause. Instead, he grabbed her arm again, harder this time, his fingers digging into the flesh above her elbow. "You're coming with me to the command building right now. You can explain to Colonel Patterson why you think you're special." The physical contact crossed a threshold that made Rodriguez move despite his earlier decision to wait. He handed his water bottle to Mills and started across the compound at a measured pace, not running but covering ground with purpose. Chun kept filming, tracking the movement as Brennan began dragging her toward the command building. She moved with him rather than resisting, her gait adjusting to match his forced march without fighting the grip. Her free hand stayed at her side, relaxed, no defensive posture even as he maintained bruising pressure on her arm. Other personnel began emerging from buildings and work areas, drawn by the commotion. A group of Marines near the motor pool stopped their conversation to watch. Two sailors heading toward the mess facility slowed their pace, observing. The incident was gathering witnesses faster than Brennan seemed to realize. His focus narrowed on his perceived righteousness and the satisfaction of enforcing what he believed were security protocols. He had no idea that among those witnesses were operators who knew her codename, who had worked missions where her decisions meant the difference between success and catastrophe. Rodriguez reached a point parallel to their path toward the command building, maintaining distance but making his presence known. Brennan glanced at him once, registered the SEAL insignia, and apparently decided a Navy operator watching had no bearing on his handling of a Marine disciplinary issue. That glance should have warned him, should have prompted the question of why a SEAL would be interested in what appeared to be routine-based security. But Brennan's confidence in his authority and his assumptions about the woman he was gripping overrode any instinct toward caution. She looked toward Rodriguez for just a moment, and something passed between them that needed no words. Her expression stayed neutral, but Rodriguez caught the slight acknowledgement in her eyes, the professional communication between operators who'd shared enough dangerous ground to develop silent understanding. He responded with the barest nod, confirming he was tracking the situation and would act if needed. Then she returned her attention forward, allowing Brennan to continue his march toward the command building and whatever consequences awaited him there. The afternoon heat pressed down on the compound as they approached the building entrance, Brennan's grip never loosening, his body language broadcasting his conviction that he was handling a security breach appropriately. Behind them, Rodriguez collected Mills and Chun, and the three SEALs followed at a distance. Chun secured his phone, the recording safely stored. Mills asked one quiet question about whether they should intervene now, and Rodriguez gave the same answer as before, but with an addition that made Mills smile grimly. "She doesn't need us to save her, but we're going to watch him destroy himself." Brennan pushed through the command building door with his free hand, pulling her inside with enough force to make the movement visibly aggressive to the clerk working the reception desk. The young Marine behind the desk looked up with alarm, clearly uncertain how to respond to a staff sergeant physically controlling another Marine through the entrance. Brennan's voice carried his authority and anger in equal measure. "I need to see Colonel Patterson immediately. This Marine was in a restricted area without authorization and needs to answer for it." The clerk's eyes moved from Brennan to the woman whose arm he still gripped, and something in her calm demeanor made the clerk hesitate before reaching for the phone to notify the commander. Outside, more SEALs were arriving at the compound, drawn by messages from Rodriguez's initial call to his team leader. The SEAL community network moved fast when one of their own, or in this case someone they considered one of their own, faced a problem. Within minutes, 8 operators had positioned themselves around the command building, a presence that would have signaled something significant to anyone paying attention. But Brennan was inside, focused on his complaint, convinced he'd caught someone violating protocol, and unaware that he'd just made the worst mistake of his military career by putting his hands on a woman whose codename was known and respected in every SEAL team room across 3 theaters of operation. Rodriguez remembered the first time he'd worked with Whisper 3 years earlier in a valley northwest of Kandahar, where his team had been pinned down by accurate fire from positions they couldn't identify. The extraction had seemed impossible until she'd appeared on the ridgeline above them, calling targets with a precision that turned their situation from desperate to manageable in under 4 minutes. He'd asked for her name afterward, and his team commander had smiled and said, "You don't need her name. You need to remember what she just did for you." The code name came later, earned through a dozen operations where her presence meant the difference between mission success and body bags. Standing outside the command building now, Rodriguez pulled out his phone and dialed his current team commander. Lieutenant Commander Hawkins answered on the second ring, and Rodriguez kept his report concise. "Sir, we have a situation." Staff Sergeant Brennan just physically grabbed Whisper and dragged her to the base commander's office. He's filing a complaint about her being in a restricted area. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds before Hawkins responded with careful control. "Is she injured?" Rodriguez glanced at the building entrance where Chun and Mills stood watching. "Negative, sir. She handled it professionally. Didn't resist, stayed calm. But Brennan left visible marks on her arm, and he has no idea who he grabbed." Hawkins' next question came with an edge that Rodriguez recognized from operations that had gone critically wrong. "Does Brennan know her actual assignment?" "No, sir. He thinks she's just a Recon Marine. Thinks he caught her somewhere she wasn't supposed to be." Another pause. Then Hawkins made the decision Rodriguez expected. "I'm contacting JSOC directly. Keep eyes on the situation, but don't intervene unless she signals she needs extraction. Document everything." Rodriguez confirmed and ended the call, then looked at Chun, who was already transferring the video file to a secure backup. Mills had moved to a position with clear sight lines to the building entrance, his body language casual, but his attention focused. Inside the building, Colonel Patterson's aide knocked on the commander's door and waited for acknowledgement before entering. The colonel looked up from the logistics report he'd been reviewing, his expression shifting to concern as the aide explained that Staff Sergeant Brennan was in the outer office with a detained Marine and needed to file an urgent complaint. Patterson stood, straightening his uniform out of habit, and told the aide to send them in. He expected a standard disciplinary matter, perhaps a junior Marine caught in an area they didn't belong. What he got was Brennan, still gripping the arm of a female corporal whose calm demeanor seemed strangely at odds with being physically detained. Patterson's first reaction was to the physical contact itself. "Staff Sergeant, release that Marine immediately." Brennan complied, but kept his body positioned to block her movement toward the door, maintaining the power dynamic even without direct contact. "Sir, I found this Marine attempting to access the communications bunker without proper authorization. She claims to have clearance above base command, which is obviously impossible for someone of her rank." Patterson's eyes moved to the woman, taking in her uniform, rank insignia, and the remarkable composure she maintained despite having just been manhandled across the compound. He noticed the red marks forming on her arm where Brennan's grip had been, and his concern deepened. "What's her name and unit, Corporal?" She provided both with professional brevity, her tone carrying none of the defensiveness or anger that would have been justified given the circumstances. Her answers were precise, factual, giving Patterson exactly the information he requested without elaboration. When he asked about her authorization to access restricted areas, she repeated what she'd told Brennan with the same careful phrasing. "Sir, my current assignment requires access that's verified through channels separate from standard-based protocols. I can provide contact information for verification if needed." Brennan interrupted before Patterson could respond, his frustration apparent in his rising voice. "Sir, she's been evasive since I detained her. She won't show paperwork, won't explain what she was doing, just keeps claiming she has special authorization. With respect, I think she's trying to talk her way out of a clear security violation." Patterson held up a hand to silence Brennan, his attention remaining on the woman whose bearings suggested military experience beyond what her rank indicated. The way she stood, the control in her voice, the absence of any visible stress response to being physically grabbed and accused, all of it registered with Patterson as inconsistent with a junior Marine caught doing something wrong. Before Patterson could press further, his aide appeared at the door with an expression Patterson had learned to recognize as incoming priority communication. "Sir, you have a secure transmission waiting. It's marked urgent. Patterson's instinct told him to handle the situation in front of him first, but protocol dictated he take priority communications immediately. He instructed everyone to wait, gave Brennan a pointed look that carried clear warning about further physical contact, and stepped into the communications room adjacent to his office. The secure line connected him to a duty officer at JSOC who asked a single question without preamble. "Colonel Patterson, do you have a Marine corporal in your office right now who was detained by one of your staff sergeants?" Patterson felt his assessment of the situation shift dramatically in that moment. "Affirmative." The corporal claims authorization through separate channels. The JSOC officer's response came with the kind of careful language that signaled classification issues. "Colonel, we're verifying details of an incident involving a personnel matter. Please maintain the current status until we provide further guidance." "Can you confirm the corporal is unharmed?" Patterson confirmed, asked for clarification on what was happening, and received only a repetition that verification was in progress and he should stand by for additional contact. He returned to his office where Brennan stood with visible satisfaction at having escalated to the commander level, apparently interpreting the secure communication as validation rather than warning. The woman remained exactly where she'd been, her posture unchanged, patient in a way that suggested she'd been in similar holding patterns before and understood how these situations unfolded. Patterson sat behind his desk and studied both of them, his operational experience telling him the power dynamic he'd initially perceived was inverted in ways he didn't yet understand. Outside, the SEAL presence around the command building had grown to include operators from 2 different teams, word having spread through the community faster than official communications could move. Master Chief Ramirez arrived and immediately sought out Rodriguez for a briefing. Rodriguez laid out the timeline from initial contact to current status, mentioning Hawkins' call to JSOC and Patterson's secure communication. Ramirez listened without interrupting, his expression hardening as Rodriguez described Brennan's physical handling. When Rodriguez finished, Ramirez asked the same question Hawkins had. "Does she need extraction?" Rodriguez shook his head. "She signaled to let it play." Ramirez accepted that, then added something that made several nearby SEALs nod in agreement. Brennan grabbed Whisper. "That's not getting buried quietly." 2 Force Recon officers arrived at the base via helicopter, their rapid response suggesting they'd been notified through Marine channels parallel to the SEAL communication network. Major Hayes and Captain Morrison headed directly for the cluster of SEALs outside the command building, and Ramirez provided them with the same briefing Rodriguez had given him. Hayes' reaction was immediate disbelief followed by anger. He physically grabbed her? Morrison's question focused on Brennan's awareness. Does he know who she is? Ramirez confirmed that Brennan had no idea, which prompted Hayes to say something about career-ending mistakes and Morrison to ask whether they should intervene with Patterson directly. Rodriguez suggested waiting, explaining that Whisper had maintained complete control of herself throughout and hadn't signaled for help. Hayes accepted that assessment, but looked troubled by the larger implications. If her cover identity is compromised on this base, we'll need to extract her entirely and reassess her operational security. Morrison pointed out that Brennan's actions had created witnesses across the compound, making containment difficult. The discussion shifted to damage control, operational continuity, and what consequences Brennan would face. The consensus among the assembled operators, both SEAL and Marine, was that Brennan had crossed a line that would cost him everything. Inside Patterson's office, the colonel asked Brennan to provide a detailed account of how he'd come to detain the corporal. Brennan's description included his observation of her approaching the communications bunker, his decision that she didn't belong there, his initial verbal challenge, and his choice to physically detain her when her responses seemed evasive. Patterson listened without expression, then asked a question that should have prompted Brennan to reconsider everything. "Staff Sergeant, did you request identification before making physical contact?" Brennan hesitated, recognizing the trap in the question, but unable to avoid answering honestly. "No, sir. Her behavior seemed suspicious, so I moved to detain first." Patterson turned to the woman and asked whether Brennan had given her opportunity to present credentials before grabbing her. No, sir, he did not. Her answer was simple, factual, and devastating to Brennan's justification. Patterson's next question went to the heart of his growing concern. Did Staff Sergeant Brennan strike you or use excessive force beyond the detention itself? She paused, as if considering how to characterize what had happened, then responded with precision. The physical contact was unnecessary and more forceful than circumstances warranted, sir, but I chose not to resist or escalate the situation. That phrasing, choosing not to resist rather than being unable to resist, registered with Patterson as another signal that this Marine was not what she appeared. A second priority communication interrupted before Patterson could continue his questioning. The aide appeared at the door again, this time with a printed message form instead of just notification. Sir, this just came through. It's marked for your immediate attention. Patterson read the message, and his expression shifted from concern to something approaching alarm. The message referenced a personnel incident involving an operator with the codename Whisper and requested confirmation of her current status and location. Patterson looked at the woman standing calmly in his office and asked the question that would begin unraveling Brennan's mistake. Is your operational codename Whisper? Her response came with the same professional restraint she'd maintained throughout. That designation exists, sir. 3 words that confirmed Patterson's worst suspicion without providing details she wasn't authorized to share. Brennan's objection erupted immediately. What designation? Sir, she's just a Recon Marine. There's no special designation. Patterson's sharp response cut through Brennan's protest. Staff Sergeant, stop talking. The command carried enough force to silence Brennan, who finally seemed to recognize that the situation had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. Patterson instructed his aide to retrieve the corporal's complete service record with appropriate classification clearances, then settled back to wait for what he suspected would be a file that explained everything and complicated his day considerably. The waiting period stretched through 15 minutes that felt longer to everyone except Whisper, who stood with the same patience she'd maintained since Brennan first grabbed her arm. Brennan shifted his weight repeatedly, his earlier confidence eroding as Patterson's demeanor transformed from standard disciplinary authority to something more cautious and measured. The colonel kept glancing at the woman, reassessing what he'd initially perceived as a routine security matter. His years of command experience told him that junior personnel caught in actual violations didn't maintain this level of composure, and they certainly didn't have JSOC making priority inquiries about their status. Patterson's aide worked in the outer office, navigating classification protocols to access the service record that required clearances above standard personnel file viewing. The process involved multiple verification steps, each one confirming to Patterson that whoever this Marine was, her documentation existed in systems he rarely accessed. When the aide finally returned with a sealed folder marked with classification headers Patterson recognized from his time in Joint Special Operations Task Forces, his concern crystallized in a certainty that Brennan had made a catastrophic error. Before opening the folder, Patterson addressed both of them with a directness born from recognizing he needed facts clearly established. Staff Sergeant Brennan, I need you to describe exactly how you made physical contact with this Marine. Be specific about your actions. Brennan recounted grabbing her arm, pulling her away from the communications bunker, maintaining his grip as he moved her across the compound, and taking hold of her arm again when her responses didn't satisfy him. He described each instance of contact as necessary detention, his tone suggesting he still believed his actions were justified despite the changing atmosphere in the office. Patterson turned to Whisper with his next question. Did you identify yourself or your assignment at any point during this encounter? Her response came with the precision of someone who understood operational security requirements. No, sir. My cover identity requires maintaining standard Marine Corps credentials unless circumstances require disclosure through proper channels. That answer, referencing cover identity rather than simply denying wrongdoing, confirmed for Patterson what the classified folder would contain. He asked one more critical question. Could this confrontation have been avoided? She considered briefly before answering. If Staff Sergeant Brennan had requested identification before physical contact, proper verification channels could have been used, sir. Brennan's objection came immediately, his voice rising with frustration. Sir, she was acting suspiciously. I made a judgment call based on her behavior and presence in a restricted area. Patterson's response carried an edge that made Brennan finally recognize how seriously wrong this had gone. Staff Sergeant, you made physical contact before verification. That's the problem. He opened the folder and began reading, his expression shifting through several stages as he absorbed information that clearly exceeded what he'd expected to find in any corporal service record. The file revealed operational history spanning 6 years across 4 theaters, attachment to multiple special operations units, confirmed participation in classified missions with success rates that impressed even Patterson's experienced assessment. Her actual assignment showed JSOC attachment with cover identity maintained through standard Marine Corps channels, exactly as she'd stated. The clearance levels documented in the file exceeded Patterson's own, and her operational designations included the codename Whisper along with several others he didn't recognize. Combat action ribbons and qualification badges listed in the file included some he'd never seen awarded to someone of her apparent age and rank. Patterson closed the folder and looked at Whisper with an expression mixing respect and concern. Then he turned to Brennan with something closer to dismay. Staff Sergeant Brennan, you physically grabbed and detained a JSOC-attached operator who was conducting authorized activities under classified orders. Brennan's face went pale as the implications crashed through his assumptions. Sir, I didn't know. She looks like a standard Marine. There's nothing about her that indicates special operations. Patterson's response cut through that justification with precision. That's exactly the point of her cover assignment. And you never gave her opportunity to verify her authorization before putting your hands on her. The reality of his situation began penetrating Brennan's understanding. He looked at Whisper as if seeing her for the first time, searching for signs he'd missed that would have warned him against his actions. She returned his gaze with the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout, offering no satisfaction at his recognition of his mistake and no anger at what he'd put her through. Her professional detachment somehow made Brennan's error feel worse, highlighting the gap between his assumptions and her actual capabilities. Patterson asked her directly about injury, his concern now focused on protecting an operator who'd been assaulted on his base. Are you hurt? Do you require medical evaluation? She declined both with quiet professionalism. I'm unharmed, sir. The bruising will fade. Patterson's next statement came with clear intent to establish accountability. For the record, you were physically detained without cause while conducting authorized operations. That's unacceptable. She accepted his statement without elaborating, and Patterson recognized she wouldn't push for consequences herself, but also wouldn't minimize what had occurred. A third communication interrupted, this one delivered as an urgent message that Patterson read with increasing gravity. JSOC was sending a liaison officer who would arrive within 2 hours. The investigation was being elevated beyond base authority, and Patterson was directed to separate the involved parties and secure Brennan, pending formal inquiry. The message also included operational security directives regarding Whisper's activities and cover status, some of which Patterson couldn't discuss even with his own staff. He looked up from a message to find both Brennan and Whisper waiting, their contrasting reactions to the extended situation revealing the fundamental difference in their training and experience. Patterson addressed Brennan first with words that ended any remaining hope the Staff Sergeant might have held. Staff Sergeant Brennan, you're confined to quarters effective immediately pending investigation. Military police will escort you. You're not to discuss this incident with anyone. Brennan started to object, then recognized the futility and simply asked what he was being charged with. Patterson's answer came without hesitation. Assault on a classified operator, security protocol violations, and conduct unbecoming. Those are preliminary. The actual charges will be determined by the investigating authority. 2 military police personnel entered the office on Patterson's call, their presence making Brennan's change in status physically manifest. The staff sergeant, who'd been so confident in his authority an hour earlier, now stood as the subject of detention himself, about to be escorted to confinement by the same MPs he'd worked alongside for months. Patterson instructed the MPs to treat Brennan correctly, but ensure he had no communication access pending the investigation. As Brennan was let out, he looked back at Whisper one final time, and she met his gaze with an expression that held neither triumph nor sympathy, just a professional acknowledgement of someone who'd been through worse and handled it better than he ever could. After Brennan's departure, Patterson's demeanor shifted to something approaching apologetic. He asked Whisper to sit, offered water, and then addressed the larger failure his base represented. This shouldn't have happened. Your operational security should have been better protected. She accepted the water, but declined to assign blame beyond the immediate actor. Staff Sergeant Brennan made assumptions based on incomplete information, sir. That's on him, not your command structure. Patterson appreciated the grace, but knew that explanation wouldn't satisfy the investigation that was coming. He asked about her current operation, whether Brennan's actions had compromised her mission timeline or effectiveness. She provided minimal detail, respecting classification boundaries while confirming that the mission could proceed if her cover identity remained viable among the broader base population. Patterson assured her that information control would be his priority, though both of them recognized that Brennan's very public detention of her across the compound had created witnesses whose awareness couldn't be completely contained. The best they could hope for was limiting the spread of information about her actual status and assignment. Patterson's phone rang with a direct call from his operations officer who'd been contacted by multiple SEAL personnel asking about the incident. The SEAL community's awareness and interest in the situation created another layer of complexity, though Patterson suspected their involvement might actually help with operational security since SEALs understood the value of discretion regarding classified operators. He told his operations officer to inform any inquiring SEAL personnel that the matter was under investigation and required their continued discretion, knowing that message would be understood and respected in ways that standard security directives might not be. Outside the command building, Rodriguez received confirmation from Hawkins that JSOC had elevated the incident and was sending a liaison officer. Hawkins also passed along guidance that SEAL personnel should maintain their documentation of the incident, but avoid direct intervention in the investigation process. Rodriguez acknowledged and shared that information with Master Chief Ramirez and the other SEALs who'd maintained their presence around the building. The Force Recon officers, Hayes and Morrison, received similar guidance through their chain of command, creating a coordinated response that protected Whisper while allowing the investigation to proceed through proper channels. Ramirez expressed what several operators were thinking when he noted that Brennan's career was finished regardless of how the formal investigation concluded. Physical contact with any operator during a classified mission violated protocols that had no gray areas, and doing so based on gender assumptions and without verification made the violation that much worse. Hayes added that the incident would likely become a case study in special operations training about operational security, proper verification procedures, and the consequences of assumption-based actions. Morrison pointed out grimly that it might also become a case study in how gender bias created security vulnerabilities when personnel made judgments based on appearance rather than protocol. Inside Patterson's office, the colonel asked Whisper a question that revealed his understanding of the broader issues at play. How often does this happen? She knew he wasn't asking about physical assault specifically, but about the dismissal, the assumptions, the failure to recognize capabilities that didn't match expected appearances. Her answer came with careful honesty. Often enough that it's not surprising, sir. Rarely enough that it still requires addressing each time. Patterson nodded, recognizing both the pattern she described and the professionalism with which she navigated it. He told her she could return to her duties if she felt comfortable doing so, or she could wait in secure quarters until the JSOC liaison arrived. She chose to return to her work, noting that maintaining her cover routine mattered for operational effectiveness. Whisper left the command building through the main entrance, her movement drawing immediate attention from the SEALs positioned outside. Rodriguez caught her eye briefly, a silent exchange confirming she was clear to proceed. She acknowledged with the barest nod and continued toward the communications bunker where Brennan had initially confronted her, resuming the work his interference had interrupted. Her return to routine carried a message to anyone watching that the incident hadn't altered her mission or her composure, exactly the kind of operational discipline that had earned her the respect of personnel who knew what to look for. She entered the bunker and moved to a secure terminal, accessing encrypted communications that required biometric verification and clearance codes Brennan would never have seen even if he demanded she show credentials. The intelligence she'd been reviewing before the confrontation remained relevant despite the hour lost to Brennan's actions. Target movement patterns, communication intercepts, coordination requirements with assets positioned beyond the base perimeter, all of it needed analysis and decision-making that couldn't wait for investigations or administrative processes to resolve. She worked with focus that compartmentalized the afternoon's events into their proper priority level, which was significantly below the operational objectives she'd been assigned to accomplish. Outside, Rodriguez organized a debrief with the SEAL personnel who'd witnessed or documented portions of the incident. Chun transferred his video files to secure storage with multiple redundant copies, ensuring the evidence couldn't be lost or tampered with regardless of how the investigation proceeded. Mills compiled a timeline of events from initial contact through Brennan's removal, noting specific statements and actions that would matter for any formal inquiry. The documentation went beyond covering themselves or whisper, extending to creating a complete record that would support whatever accountability mechanisms the investigation deployed. Master Chief Ramirez contacted the senior SEAL representative at Theater Command, providing a concise briefing on the incident and its potential operational implications. The concern wasn't just about one staff sergeant's misconduct, but about whether Whisper's effectiveness on this base had been compromised by the public nature of Brennan's actions. Theater Command acknowledged the concern and indicated that operational assessments would occur parallel to the disciplinary investigation, evaluating whether her cover identity remained viable or required extraction and reassignment. That decision would ultimately rest with JSOC, but SEAL Command wanted their perspective documented in the evaluation process. Hayes and Morrison conducted their own notification up the Marine Corps chain, ensuring Force Recon leadership understood that one of their operators on classified attachment had been physically assaulted by base personnel. Their report emphasized both Whisper's professional handling of the situation and the systemic issues that allowed a staff sergeant to physically detain an operator without first verifying authorization through proper channels. Morrison noted in his report that the incident revealed gaps in operational security protocols when classified personnel operated undercover identities on conventional bases, gaps that put both the operators and their missions at risk. Inside the communications bunker, Whisper completed her intelligence analysis and transmitted her findings through secure channels to the task force coordinating the broader operation she supported. Her report made no mention of Brennan's interference, focusing entirely on target assessment and recommended action timelines. The professionalism of separating personal incidents from mission reporting reflected training and experience that operated on a different level than standard military discipline. She understood that her value came from reliability and focus, not from allowing disruptions to compromise effectiveness regardless of how justified any distraction might be. Patterson spent the hour after Whisper's departure preparing for the JSOC liaison's arrival. He reviewed base security protocols, assessed what documentation existed regarding classified personnel operating undercover, and recognized significant deficiencies in how his command handled operators whose actual assignments differed from their apparent roles. The procedures assumed that anyone with special access would be identified through standard verification systems. But Whisper's case demonstrated that assumption failed when cover requirements meant operators presented as conventional personnel. He drafted preliminary recommendations for protocol improvements, knowing the investigation would likely mandate changes, but wanting to demonstrate proactive response. Brennan sat in the quarters where MPs had confined him, the reality of a situation settling into understanding that felt increasingly catastrophic. He replayed the confrontation in his mind, searching for the moment where he could have chosen differently and recognizing multiple decision points where better judgment would have prevented this outcome. The initial observation of her near the bunker, the choice to challenge rather than verify, the decision to grab her arm instead of requesting identification, the escalation when she gave answers he interpreted as evasive rather than appropriately classified. Each choice had seemed reasonable in the moment, justified by his assessment of the situation and his assumptions about a junior Marine who didn't look like someone with special operations credentials. His thoughts circled back to those assumptions with growing discomfort. He'd seen a woman, a corporal, someone smaller than him, and he'd concluded she didn't belong where he found her. The physical detention had come easily because he'd never considered she might be someone he had no authority to touch, much less someone whose capabilities exceeded his own by margins he couldn't begin to measure. The SEAL's reactions made sense now, their careful observation and documentation revealing they'd known exactly who he was manhandling and had watched him destroy his career with complete awareness of what he couldn't see. The memory of their expressions carried a judgment he finally understood he'd earned. Lieutenant Commander Hawkins arrived at the base via helicopter 90 minutes after Rodriguez's initial call, his presence signaling SEAL Command's direct interest in protecting one of their operational assets. He met with Rodriguez, Ramirez, and the other SEALs who'd witnessed the incident, reviewing their documentation and timeline with the thoroughness of someone who understood these details would matter for multiple audiences. Hawkins asked specific questions about Whisper's visible condition, Brennan's force level, and witness reactions, building a comprehensive picture that went beyond the basic facts to capture context and implications. After the SEAL debrief, Hawkins requested a meeting with Colonel Patterson, who received him in his office with the recognition that this conversation would establish expectations for the investigation's scope and seriousness. Hawkins introduced himself and stated his purpose with directness. "Commander, I'm here because one of your personnel assaulted an operator my teams have worked with across multiple deployments. I need to understand how this happened and what measures will prevent recurrence." Patterson appreciated the straightforward approach and responded in kind, acknowledging the security protocol failures and outlining his preliminary assessment of systemic gaps. Hawkins asked whether Patterson had known Whisper was operating on his base undercover assignment. Patterson admitted he hadn't, which prompted a discussion about notification procedures for classified personnel and the balance between operational security and command awareness. Hawkins explained that in Whisper's case, the mission requirements dictated minimal disclosure even to base command, but that decision now appeared to have created vulnerability that Brennan's actions had exploited. Patterson agreed and suggested that future protocols might include notification to commanders without revealing specific mission details, providing enough awareness to prevent incidents without compromising operational effectiveness. The conversation shifted to Brennan's status and the investigation timeline. Patterson confirmed the staff sergeant was confined and had been instructed not to discuss the incident. Hawkins indicated that SOC's liaison officer would arrive shortly and would coordinate with Patterson on investigation procedures, but made clear that SEAL Command expected thorough accountability for what had occurred. Patterson assured him the investigation would be comprehensive and asked whether Whisper required any support or accommodation. Hawkins replied that she declined assistance and was continuing her work, which told Patterson everything he needed to know about her resilience and professional standards. Hayes and Morrison joined the meeting at Patterson's invitation, bringing the Force Recon perspective on their operator's status and needs. Hayes reported that Whisper had maintained contact with her parent unit and confirmed her ability to continue the mission despite the incident. Morrison raised concerns about base personnel awareness of her actual status, noting that Brennan's public attention of her had created witnesses who might compromise her cover through speculation or discussion. Hawkins acknowledged that concern and indicated the operational security assessment would determine whether her cover remained viable or required extraction. Patterson asked a question that revealed his understanding of the broader implications beyond just Brennan's misconduct. How many other operators like her are currently working undercover on conventional bases? Hawkins exchanged glances with Hayes before answering carefully. Enough that this incident has significance beyond the individuals involved, Colonel. Patterson recognized that answer meant protocols needed examination across theater, not just on his base. He committed to supporting whatever systemic reviews the investigation prompted and asked how he could best support Whisper's operational effectiveness while the investigation proceeded. The discussion turned to practical matters of timeline and coordination. SOC's liaison officer would arrive within the hour and would establish investigation procedures that balanced accountability with operational security. Witness interviews would need careful handling to avoid compromising classified information while still gathering complete evidence about Brennan's actions. Video and photographic documentation would require classification review before inclusion in formal records. The investigation would involve multiple authorities including JAG, JSOC, SEAL Command, and Force Recon, creating complexity that required careful coordination to prevent gaps or conflicts. Hawkins asked to speak with Whisper directly, and Patterson provided secure communication access. The conversation lasted 5 minutes, during which Hawkins confirmed her status, received her operational assessment, and ensured she felt supported by the response to Brennan's actions. When he disconnected, Hawkins told Patterson and the others that Whisper had expressed confidence in completing her mission and had requested minimal disruption to her cover routine. That request carried weight with everyone in the room, reinforcing their understanding that her priorities remained focused on mission success rather than personal vindication or administrative processes. The JSOC liaison officer arrived precisely on schedule, a lieutenant colonel named Grant who carried himself with the efficient authority of someone accustomed to handling sensitive situations across multiple command structures. His first action after landing was to meet privately with Whisper, a conversation that occurred in a secure facility away from the main base operations. Grant's questions focused on her operational status, mission timeline, and assessment of whether Brennan's actions had compromised her effectiveness or safety. She provided direct answers that confirmed her mission remained viable, her cover identity intact among those who mattered for operational purposes, and her physical condition unimpaired despite the bruising Brennan had inflicted. Grant asked whether she wanted to press charges beyond whatever institutional response the investigation would generate. Her answer reflected the pragmatism that had guided her response throughout the incident. "Sir, I want accountability that prevents this from happening to the next operator. What that looks like procedurally is your determination." Grant appreciated her focus on systemic improvement rather than personal vindication, though he made clear the investigation would document every aspect of Brennan's misconduct regardless of her preferences. The assault on a classified operator during an active mission constituted violations serious enough to warrant maximum accountability even without victim advocacy driving the process. Their conversation shifted to operational security and the question of whether her continued presence on the base served mission objectives or created unnecessary risk. Grant had reviewed the intelligence she'd been gathering and recognized its value to broader task force operations. The targets she monitored wouldn't relocate in response to base personnel conflicts they knew nothing about, which meant her access and positioning retained full effectiveness. However, Grant also considered whether Brennan's public detention of her had created enough witness awareness to compromise her low-profile status. Whisper's assessment carried weight in that calculation, and she believed her cover remained functional for the mission timeline that mattered. Grant authorized mission continuation with modified parameters that included closer SEAL team positioning for rapid response if complications arose. Rodriguez's team would maintain 5-minute standby rather than the 15-minute response time previously established, a change that reflected increased caution without pulling her from effective operations. Grant also directed enhanced communication protocols that would give her direct contact with him personally if any further incidents or threats emerged. The modifications balanced operational effectiveness with appropriate force protection, acknowledging that Brennan's actions had created a changed environment even if the specific threat he'd posed was now contained. After meeting with Whisper, Grant convened a command briefing that included Patterson, Hawkins, Hayes, Morrison, and Master Chief Ramirez. He opened by establishing the investigation's scope and his authority to coordinate across the multiple commands that had equities in the outcome. The investigation would examine Brennan's specific actions, the systemic protocols that had failed to prevent the incident, and the broader patterns of conduct that might have enabled his behavior. Grant made clear that accountability would extend beyond one staff sergeant if the evidence revealed command climate or training deficiencies that contributed to the assault. Patterson provided his preliminary assessment of security protocol gaps, acknowledging that his base lacked adequate procedures for protecting classified personnel operating undercover. Grant asked pointed questions about whether other instances of inappropriate conduct toward female personnel had been reported or addressed, creating a record that suggested pattern examination would be part of the investigation. Patterson admitted that his awareness of such issues had been limited, which prompted Grant to note that command climate assessments would need to include gender dynamics and whether the environment enabled assumption-based judgments like those Brennan had demonstrated. Hawkins briefed the SEAL community's documentation and offered full cooperation with investigation processes. He emphasized that SEAL teams had worked with Whisper across multiple theaters and could provide extensive testimony about her capabilities, professionalism, and the respect she'd earned among special operations personnel. That testimony would establish the stark contrast between how operators who knew her treated her versus how Brennan had chosen to act based purely on appearance and assumption. Grant indicated that contrast would be relevant for understanding not just what Brennan did wrong, but what right looked like in terms of professional conduct toward capable personnel regardless of gender or apparent rank. Hayes and Morrison provided Force Recon's perspective on their operator's assignment and the unique challenges of maintaining cover identities that required operators to accept treatment beneath their actual status. Morrison noted that Whisper's case wasn't isolated, that multiple operators faced similar dynamics when operating undercover, and that the military needed better frameworks for protecting them from the kind of misconduct Brennan had committed. Grant acknowledged that recommendation and indicated his final report would address policy implications for how special operations forces manage personnel in cover assignments across conventional military environments. The discussion turned to Brennan's background and whether his personnel file revealed relevant history. Patterson's staff had compiled his records, which showed competent performance evaluations, but also subtle patterns in how he interacted with junior female personnel. Nothing had risen to the level of formal complaints, but counseling records and peer feedback suggested he maintained attitudes about gender roles that influenced his leadership approach. Grant noted those patterns would be examined as part of determining whether Brennan's assault on Whisper reflected momentary poor judgment or deeper issues that the command should have identified and addressed earlier. Grant outlined the investigation timeline, which would include witness interviews beginning immediately, evidence review over the following 3 days, and preliminary findings within a week. The compressed schedule reflected both the seriousness of the incident and the operational requirement to resolve uncertainties about Whisper's status quickly. Formal charges against Brennan would likely be preferred within 10 days, followed by court-martial proceedings unless he chose to accept non-judicial punishment for offenses that Grant made clear would result in career-ending consequences regardless of adjudication method. After the command briefing, Grant conducted individual interviews with key witnesses. Rodriguez provided detailed testimony about observing Brennan grab Whisper, describing the force used and her professional response. He also testified about the SEAL community's knowledge of Whisper's actual capabilities and the respect she commanded among operators who'd worked with her. Rodriguez's account established not just what happened, but the context of an assault on someone whose operational record exceeded most personnel on the base, including Brennan, by substantial margins. Chen's video documentation provided visual evidence that corroborated every witness account and captured Brennan's aggressive body language, the visible force of his grip, and Whisper's composed response throughout the confrontation. Grant reviewed the footage multiple times, noting specific moments where Brennan could have de-escalated or verified authorization, but chose continued aggression instead. The video would become central evidence in any proceedings, providing undeniable documentation of assault that no defense strategy could explain away as misunderstanding or appropriate detention. Mills testified about the SEAL team's decision to document rather than immediately intervene, explaining their recognition that Whisper had the situation controlled and their judgment that allowing events to unfold would create accountability stronger than intervention might achieve. Grant questioned whether that decision had been appropriate given the assault occurring, and Mills defended it by noting Whisper had never signaled need for assistance and had maintained complete tactical awareness throughout. The decision reflected trust in her capabilities rather than indifference to her treatment, a distinction Grant acknowledged, even while noting the complexity of such judgment calls. Other Marines who'd witnessed portions of the incident provided testimony that established how public Brennan's actions had been and how uncomfortable many observers had felt watching the confrontation. Several witnesses noted they'd considered intervening, but hadn't due to uncertainty about challenging a staff sergeant's actions and assumptions that he must have legitimate authority for what he was doing. Their testimony revealed how rank and gender dynamics had combined to enable Brennan's misconduct despite multiple people recognizing something felt wrong about the situation. Grant interviewed Patterson about command climate and whether indicators of problematic attitudes toward female personnel had been visible before this incident. Patterson acknowledged that subtle signs had probably existed but hadn't been aggregated or elevated to his awareness in ways that would have prompted intervention. Grant's questions made clear that command responsibility for climate extended beyond responding to formal complaints to include recognizing patterns and addressing attitudes before they manifested in serious misconduct. Patterson accepted that assessment and committed to implementing changes regardless of what the investigation specifically mandated. The most significant interview came when Grant spoke with Brennan in the quarters where he remained confined. Brennan had spent hours confronting the reality of his actions and arrived at the interview with visible recognition of his mistake's magnitude. Grant's questions systematically dismantled every justification Brennan attempted to offer, establishing that he'd had multiple opportunities to verify authorization before physical contact, that his stated concerns about security could have been addressed through proper channels, and that his choice to grab and detain reflected assumptions rather than legitimate security procedures. When Grant asked why Brennan had believed physical detention was appropriate, the staff sergeant's answer revealed the core problem. She just looked like someone who didn't belong there. I saw a junior Marine acting suspicious, and I made a judgment call. Grant pressed on what specifically had been suspicious, and Brennan struggled to articulate anything beyond her presence and his instinct that she shouldn't be accessing that area. The absence of any actual suspicious behavior beyond his assumptions laid bare how gender and appearance had driven his actions more than any legitimate security concerns. Grant asked whether Brennan had treated male Marines similarly, whether he grabbed and detained male personnel based on suspicion without verification. Brennan admitted he hadn't, that he would have asked a male Marine for identification first before any physical contact. That admission established that gender had fundamentally influenced his approach, creating different standards for female personnel that resulted in assault when applied to someone whose actual status he'd never bothered to verify. Grant noted that admission would be central to the charges Brennan would face and the recommendations about his fitness to continue serving. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate incident as Grant's team examined broader patterns that might have enabled Brennan's conduct. Interviews with female personnel across the base revealed a climate where subtle dismissals and assumption-based judgments occurred frequently enough to be normalized, though rarely escalating to physical assault. Junior enlisted women described being questioned about their presence in technical areas, having their expertise doubted until male personnel confirmed it, and facing different standards for proving competence than their male counterparts encountered. The pattern didn't excuse Brennan's actions, but contextualized them within a systemic issue that required command attention beyond punishing one staff sergeant. Grant's team discovered that 3 formal complaints about gender-based conduct had been filed over the previous 18 months, each handled at levels below Patterson's awareness and resolved through counseling rather than serious disciplinary action. None involved Brennan directly, but they established that the base climate included attitudes similar to those his assault had demonstrated. Grant's preliminary findings indicated that command climate assessments had failed to capture or address these dynamics effectively, allowing problematic patterns to persist until they manifested in an assault on a classified operator whose capabilities should have been irrelevant to whether she deserved professional respect. Patterson received Grant's preliminary assessment with recognition that his command bore responsibility for climate failures, even though he hadn't directly enabled Brennan's specific actions. Grant's report noted that Patterson had operated with good intentions but insufficient awareness of how gender dynamics affected personnel experience, particularly for women in technical or operational roles. The recommendations included mandatory command climate training, enhanced reporting mechanisms for conduct concerns, and leadership evaluation criteria that specifically assess commanders on their effectiveness at creating environments where capability rather than appearance determine treatment. While the investigation documented systemic issues, Whisper continued her mission with the enhanced support Grant had authorized. Rodriguez's SEAL team maintained close positioning, their presence providing rapid response capability without interfering with her operational activities. She moved through her cover routine with the same professionalism that had characterized her response to Brennan's assault, demonstrating the compartmentalization that allowed elite operators to maintain effectiveness despite disruptions that would compromise less trained personnel. Her ability to focus on mission objectives while institutional processes addressed the assault validated Grant's decision to allow continued operations rather than extracting her immediately. The intelligence Whisper gathered proved time-sensitive and valuable, justifying the calculated risk of keeping her in place. She identified communication patterns that revealed a planned meeting of high-value targets, information that enabled a task force operation resulting in successful interdiction. Grant's report would later note that pulling her from the base in response to Brennan's assault would have cost that operational success, creating strategic consequences for misconduct that had already inflicted personal and institutional costs. The mission's success didn't excuse what had happened to her, but it underscored the professional stakes of ensuring operators like her could work effectively without facing assault from personnel whose assumptions overrode proper protocols. Back in confinement, Brennan received notification that formal charges would be preferred within 48 hours. His defense counsel outlined the evidence against him and the limited options available given video documentation, multiple witness testimony, and his own admissions during Grant's interview. The charges would include assault, conduct unbecoming, violation of security protocols, and potentially additional specifications related to the gender-based nature of his actions. His counsel explained that the evidence made contesting the charges essentially futile, and that his best option involved accepting responsibility and hoping for some mitigation of consequences that would definitely include discharge and likely include confinement. The reality of losing his career settled over Brennan with finality he could no longer deny or minimize. 20 years of service would end in disgrace because he'd made assumptions about a woman whose capabilities he'd never bothered to verify. The SEALs he'd seen observing the confrontation had known exactly what he was doing wrong, had documented it thoroughly, and had watched him destroy himself with complete awareness that he couldn't see past his prejudices long enough to ask basic questions before putting his hands on someone. The memory of their expressions haunted him more than the formal charges, carrying a judgment from people who recognized competence when they saw it and who'd witnessed him reveal himself as someone who didn't. Grant convened a second command briefing to present preliminary findings and outline next steps. The assault charges against Brennan were solid and would proceed to court-martial given the seriousness of the offense and the operational implications. The systemic climate issues would be addressed through command-directed changes that Patterson would implement immediately rather than waiting for the investigation's final report. Grant emphasized that accountability needed to operate at multiple levels, punishing Brennan's misconduct while also correcting the institutional failures that had allowed problematic attitudes to persist until they manifested in assault. Patterson announced immediate policy changes that included mandatory training on appropriate conduct toward all personnel regardless of gender, enhanced protocols for verifying authorization before any detention or physical contact, and revised reporting mechanisms that would conduct complaints directly to his attention rather than being resolved at lower levels. He also committed to quarterly command climate assessments specifically focused on gender dynamics and professional respect, with results that would affect leadership evaluations and promotion recommendations. The changes acknowledged institutional responsibility without minimizing Brennan's personal accountability for choosing assault over verification. Hawkins reported that SEAL Command had conducted its own review of how special operations personnel in cover assignments were protected and supported. Their findings aligned with Grant's assessment that protocols needed improvement, particularly regarding notification to base commanders about classified personnel presence, even without revealing specific mission details. SEAL Command would implement changes requiring minimal awareness notification that balanced operational security with commander responsibility to protect all personnel on their bases, including those whose actual assignments differed from their apparent roles. Hayes provided Force Recon's parallel assessment, noting that Whisper's experience wasn't unique among operators working undercover. Multiple personnel had reported similar challenges with assumption-based treatment, though few incidents had escalated to physical assault. Force Recon recommended enhanced training for operators on cover assignments about their rights and resources if confronted inappropriately, as well as clearer guidance to conventional commands about verification procedures when questions arose about personnel presence or activities. The recommendations aim to prevent future incidents while acknowledging that cover requirements sometimes meant operators had to accept treatment beneath their actual status for mission effectiveness. Grant addressed the question of whether Whisper's gender had made her more vulnerable to the kind of assault Brennan committed. The evidence clearly showed gender had driven his assumptions and his choice to use physical force without verification, creating a situation female operators faced more frequently than male counterparts in similar cover assignments. Grant's recommendations included specific attention to how gender dynamics affected operators' safety and effectiveness, with policy changes designed to address those differential risks through better training, clear protocols, and enhanced accountability for conduct that treated personnel differently based on gender rather than actual authorization or capability. The briefing concluded with discussion of timeline for final reports and implementation of recommended changes. Grant would complete his investigation within 2 weeks. Formal charges against Brennan would proceed immediately, and the command climate changes Patterson outlined would begin implementation before the investigation concluded. The accelerated timeline reflected recognition that waiting for complete bureaucratic processes before addressing known problems would represent continued failure rather than appropriate deliberation. Institutional learning needed to happen in parallel with individual accountability, not sequentially after it. Rodriguez and the SEAL team maintained their enhanced support posture for Whisper's operations, their presence providing security while also sending a message within the base community about how special operations forces protected their own. The SEAL's visible positioning near areas where Whisper worked created awareness that she had backing from personnel whose reputation commanded respect, indirectly enhancing her safety by making clear that any future misconduct toward her would face immediate response from operators who understood her value and wouldn't hesitate to intervene if circumstances required. Master Chief Ramirez used the incident as a teaching opportunity with junior SEALs, explaining how operators needed to recognize capability regardless of how it presented, and how assumptions based on appearance represented failures of professional judgment that could cost missions and lives. He described Whisper's operational record in terms that made clear why the SEAL community valued and protected her, emphasizing that respect came from what she'd accomplished rather than from any need to prove herself to people who weren't capable of recognizing excellence when they saw it. The lesson extended beyond gender to the broader principle that elite operators evaluated each other on performance and reliability rather than on surface characteristics that didn't determine tactical effectiveness. The investigation's preliminary phase concluded with evidence compiled, charges ready for preferral, and systemic changes initiated. Grant's team had documented not just Brennan's assault, but the institutional context that had failed to prevent it, creating a comprehensive record that would serve multiple purposes. The evidence would support prosecution of the immediate offense, while also providing foundation for broader policy reforms across commands where special operations personnel worked undercover. Whisper's experience became a catalyst for changes that would protect future operators from facing assault based on assumptions that overrode verification protocols and professional respect. Formal charges were preferred against Brennan on schedule, delivered by a JAG officer who read the specifications with clinical precision that made each violation clear and undeniable. Assault on a superior officer, though Whisper's actual rank and position exceeded his despite her cover identity's corporal insignia. Violation of security protocols by detaining classified personnel during authorized operations. Conduct unbecoming through gender-based differential treatment that demonstrated prejudice affecting professional judgment. Additional specifications detailed the physical force used, the public nature of the assault, and the operational risk created by his actions. Each charge carried potential for significant confinement and guaranteed discharge if convicted. Brennan listened to the charges with the resignation of someone who'd already accepted the inevitable outcome. His defense counsel had advised him that contesting the charges would only extend the process without changing the result, given video evidence that documented everything and witness testimony from personnel whose credibility exceeded his by substantial margins. The question wasn't whether he'd be convicted, but what sentence would result and whether he'd face additional federal charges beyond the military justice system. His counsel indicated that cooperation and acceptance of responsibility might yield some mitigation, though nothing would prevent the career destruction and permanent record that would follow him into civilian life. The court-martial was scheduled for 3 weeks out, a timeline compressed from standard procedures due to the operational implications and the multiple commands with interest in resolution. Grant coordinated the scheduling with JAG authorities, ensuring the proceedings would accommodate classified testimony without compromising operational security. Whisper would need to testify, but protocols existed for protecting her identity and current mission details while still allowing her to provide complete evidence about what Brennan had done. The balance between justice and security required careful management that Grant's experience with special operations legal issues made him qualified to navigate. Patterson implemented the command climate changes he'd outlined, beginning with mandatory training for all personnel on appropriate conduct and verification protocols. The training specifically addressed assumption-based judgments and how gender bias affected professional interactions, using sanitized versions of Brennan's case as examples without identifying the specific individuals involved. Instructors emphasized that capability couldn't be determined by appearance, that proper verification procedures existed for reasons that this incident had demonstrated, and that physical contact without authorization constituted assault regardless of the justifications offered. The training created discomfort for some personnel who recognized their own assumptions reflected in the case study, exactly the reaction that indicated the instruction was reaching its targets. Enhanced reporting mechanisms went into effect, creating direct channels for conduct complaints to reach Patterson's attention without filtering through intermediate chains of command that had previously resolved issues at lower levels. The new system included anonymous reporting options and third-party advocacy for personnel who wanted support in bringing forward concerns. Patterson personally briefed all unit commanders on his expectations for climate and conduct, making clear that leadership evaluations would now include specific assessment of their effectiveness at creating professional environments where all personnel receive treatment based on capability rather than characteristics irrelevant to job performance. Whisper completed her mission objectives ahead of the accelerated timeline Grant had established. The intelligence she'd gathered enabled multiple task force operations that achieved strategic objectives while validating the decision to keep her in place despite the assault she'd endured. Grant's operational assessment noted that her performance throughout the incident and investigation demonstrated exactly the kind of resilience and focus that made her valuable to Special Operations Forces. She'd compartmentalized personal impact, maintained covert discipline, completed assigned tasks, and provided professional testimony for the investigation without allowing Brennan's misconduct to compromise any aspect of her effectiveness. With her mission complete, Whisper prepared for rotation to her next assignment, the timing allowing her to depart before the court-martial drew additional attention to her presence. Grant coordinated her transition to ensure she left the base with appropriate recognition from commands that understood her contributions, even if broader personnel populations never learned what she'd accomplished. Rodriguez and the SEAL team held a private acknowledgement where operators who'd worked with her over the years expressed respect and offered support, making clear that the community saw her as one of their own regardless of service branch or assignment structure. Hayes and Morrison conducted her force recon checkout, reviewing lessons learned from the incident and discussing how those insights would inform future operator assignments. Whisper provided candid feedback about vulnerabilities in cover identity protocols and recommendations for better protecting personnel in similar situations. Her perspective carried weight because she'd experienced the failure directly while maintaining enough professional detachment to analyze what systemic changes would prevent recurrence. Hayes committed to incorporating her recommendations into force recon policy, and Morrison noted that her handling of a situation would become a case study in operational discipline under adverse circumstances. Before departing, Whisper met privately with Grant to provide her final assessment of the investigation and its outcomes. She expressed appreciation for the thoroughness of the accountability process, while noting that her primary concern remained preventing future operators from facing similar assaults. Grant assured her that the policy changes at multiple command levels would create better protection, though he acknowledged that cultural change took time and persistence beyond any single incident or investigation. She accepted that reality with the pragmatism that had characterized her entire response, recognizing that perfect prevention wasn't achievable, but meaningful improvement remained worthwhile. Grant asked whether she wanted any direct communication with Brennan before leaving, an opportunity for her to confront him about the impact of his actions or to accept any apology he might offer. She declined, explaining that nothing he could say would matter to her assessment of him or change what had occurred. Her professional interest was in institutional accountability that protected others, not in personal vindication or emotional closure from someone whose judgment she didn't respect. Grant understood and appreciated her focus on systemic outcomes over individual confrontation, though he noted the option would remain available if she changed her perspective. Patterson requested a meeting with Whisper before her departure, wanting to apologize directly for the command failures that had allowed Brennan's assault to occur. She received his apology with grace, while making clear that she held him accountable for climate rather than for Brennan's specific choices. Patterson acknowledged that distinction and described the changes he'd implemented, asking whether they addressed the vulnerabilities she'd experienced. She provided honest feedback that the changes represented meaningful improvement, while noting that their effectiveness would depend on sustained leadership commitment rather than temporary attention following a high-profile incident. The conversation between Patterson and Whisper revealed mutual respect between a commander recognizing his blind spots and an operator who understood that good faith failures differed from willful negligence. Patterson asked what else he should know about special operations personnel working undercover on his base, and she provided insights about the challenges operators face maintaining cover while navigating environments that didn't recognize their actual capabilities or authority. Her perspective helped Patterson understand dynamics he'd been completely unaware of, education that would inform how he commanded going forward and how he mentored junior commanders who'd faced similar challenges. Rodriguez walked with Whisper to the helicopter that would take her off the base, their conversation covering shared operations and mutual contacts within the special operations community. He thanked her for the restraint she'd shown during Brennan's assault, noting that she could have ended the confrontation physically at any point, but had chosen a path that created accountability through proper channels rather than immediate violence. She responded that violence would have felt satisfying, but wouldn't have addressed the systemic issues that made Brennan think his actions were acceptable. Rodriguez agreed and said the SEAL community would be watching the court-martial outcome to ensure justice matched the severity of what Brennan had done. Before boarding, Whisper looked back at the base where she'd been assaulted, where she continued working professionally despite that assault, and where her experience had catalyzed changes that would affect how commands treated operators for years to come. The view held no particular emotion for her, beyond the operational assessment, that she'd accomplished what she'd been assigned to do and had handled the complication Brennan created without allowing it to compromise mission effectiveness. That professional detachment represented exactly the mindset that made her valuable to Special Operations Forces and that Brennan had never been capable of recognizing through his assumptions about what a capable operator looked like. The helicopter lifted off with Whisper aboard, taking her to the next assignment where she'd operate under whatever cover the mission required, and where new personnel would make their own assessments about who she was based on whatever limited information her cover identity provided. Some would recognize capability when they saw it, others wouldn't, and she'd navigate those dynamics with the same professional focus she'd maintained throughout her career. The difference now was that institutional protections existed that hadn't before, protocols that emerged from her experience, and that would shield future operators from facing what Brennan had done to her without justification or consequence. Back on the base, preparations for the court-martial continued with witness coordination, evidence organization, and procedural planning. The case had drawn attention at levels far above a typical assault prosecution because it involved operational security, gender dynamics, and systemic command issues that extended beyond individual misconduct. Multiple senior officers would attend the proceedings, sending a message about how seriously the services took assault on special operations personnel and about institutional commitment to accountability. Brennan would face not just military justice, but the focused attention of commands that wanted the outcome to establish clear precedent about unacceptable conduct and its consequences. The court-martial convened in a secure facility equipped to handle classified testimony, with a panel of senior officers who'd been briefed on the operational security requirements without compromising the proceedings' integrity. Brennan entered wearing his service uniform stripped of leadership badges he'd previously earned, a visual reminder of status he'd lost before the trial even began. His defense counsel sat beside him with documents that outlined a defense strategy built entirely on mitigation rather than contestation, acknowledging guilt while hoping to influence sentencing through demonstrated remorse and acceptance of responsibility. The prosecution presented its case with methodical efficiency, beginning with Chen's video documentation that showed every moment of Brennan's assault from initial grab through forced march to the command building. The panel watched Brennan's hand clamp around Whisper's arm with visible force, saw him yank her away from the bunker entrance, observe his aggressive body language, and the grip he maintained despite her professional compliance. The video eliminated any possibility of characterizing the encounter as routine or justified detention, documenting assault that no amount of context could excuse or minimize. Rodriguez testified about observing the incident, providing detailed description of the force Brennan used and Whisper's controlled response throughout. His testimony established that multiple SEAL personnel had recognized her immediately, had understood Brennan was making a catastrophic mistake, and had documented everything while assessing whether intervention was needed. Rodriguez explained their decision to let events unfold rather than immediately extracting her, noting that she'd maintained tactical control of herself and the situation despite being physically assaulted by someone who had no idea what he was doing or who he was doing it to. Mills and other SEAL witnesses corroborated Rodriguez's testimony, building a comprehensive picture of how the special operations community had watched Brennan destroy his career with full awareness that he couldn't see past his assumptions long enough to verify authorization before putting his hands on someone. Their collective testimony demonstrated the contrast between operators who recognize capability regardless of appearance and someone whose prejudices prevented him from following basic verification protocols that would have revealed his mistake before physical contact occurred. Patterson testified about receiving notification from JSOC, reading Whisper's classified service record, and recognizing that Brennan had assaulted an operator whose capabilities and clearances exceeded most personnel on the base. His testimony established the operational context of what Brennan had interrupted, the security protocols he'd violated, and the command climate issues his actions had revealed. Patterson acknowledged his own failures to recognize and address problematic attitudes before they manifested an assault, accepting institutional responsibility while making clear that Brennan's choices remained his own despite any climate factors that might have influenced his thinking. Grant testified about the investigation's findings, presenting evidence of Brennan's admission that he would have treated a male Marine differently and would have requested identification before physical contact if the subject hadn't been female. That testimony established beyond any dispute that gender had driven Brennan's decision-making, creating differential treatment that resulted in assault on someone whose actual status he'd never bothered to verify, because his assumptions told him she couldn't possibly be someone he needed to respect or properly process. The prosecution called Whisper as its final witness, her appearance creating visible impact in the courtroom despite the operational security measures that protected some aspects of her identity. She testified via secure video link from an undisclosed location. Her testimony provided under procedures that allowed the panel to assess her credibility while preventing compromise of her current assignment. Her account of the assault was factual and unemotional, describing Brennan's actions without embellishment while acknowledging her own choices to comply rather than resist physically despite her capability to end the confrontation through force. The panel members asked Whisper questions that revealed their understanding of the unique dynamics special operations personnel faced when working undercover. One officer asked why she hadn't identified herself immediately when Brennan challenged her, and she explained that her cover requirements meant maintaining her Marine corporal identity unless circumstances forced disclosure through proper channels. Another asked whether she'd felt threatened by Brennan's physical actions, and she responded honestly that she'd felt controlled but not threatened because she'd maintained awareness of her options throughout, choosing de-escalation over confrontation for operational rather than personal reasons. When asked about the impact of Brennan's assault on her mission effectiveness, Whisper testified that she continued her assigned work without compromise, completed all objectives, and had not allowed his misconduct to affect her professional performance. That testimony demonstrated her resilience, while also highlighting what Brennan had risked through his actions, endangering operations whose significance he'd had no clearance to know about, and no business interrupting through unauthorized physical detention. The panel's reaction suggested they understood the full scope of his mistake extended beyond personal assault to operational security violation with potential strategic consequences. The defense presented its case with the limited options available given the evidence. Brennan's counsel called character witnesses who described his previous service record and testified about his reputation before this incident. The testimony established that he'd been a competent NCO in many respects, but it couldn't overcome the documented assault and his own admissions about the gender-based assumptions that had driven his actions. The defense's mitigation strategy emphasized Brennan's expressed remorse, his acceptance of responsibility, and his request that the panel consider his prior service when determining sentence. Brennan testified on his own behalf. His statement focused on acknowledging what he'd done wrong and accepting full responsibility for his choices. He admitted he'd made assumptions based on gender, that he'd grabbed Whisper without verifying her authorization, and that he'd escalated when de-escalation options existed. His testimony showed genuine recognition of his failures, though it came too late to change the outcome or undo the assault. When the prosecution cross-examined him about what he'd learned from the incident, his answers revealed understanding that respect and verification protocols existed for reasons his prejudices had prevented him from recognizing until consequences forced that recognition. The panel deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with findings of guilty on all charges and specifications. The conviction surprised no one given the evidence, but the speed of deliberation suggested the panel had found the case straightforward rather than requiring extensive discussion or debate. Sentencing would follow additional testimony and argument, but the guilty findings ensured Brennan would face discharge and confinement, the only questions being duration and whether additional administrative actions would follow the criminal punishment. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution presented evidence of the broader impact of Brennan's actions beyond the immediate assault. Grant testified about the policy changes multiple commands had implemented in response to the incident, the operational security reviews required, and the recognition that special operations personnel working undercover faced vulnerabilities that Brennan's conduct had exploited. His testimony established that accountability needed to reflect not just what Brennan had done to one operator, but what his actions represented in terms of systemic risk to classified personnel and missions. Hayes and Morrison testified about Force Recon's assessment of how the assault had affected operator confidence and effectiveness. They described conversations with multiple personnel who worked undercover assignments and who'd expressed concern that they too might face misconduct from conventional forces personnel whose assumptions overrode verification protocols. The testimony made clear that Brennan's sentence needed to send a message strong enough to deter similar conduct and reassure operators that assaulting them carried severe consequences regardless of justifications offered. Master Chief Ramirez testified about the SEAL community's perspective, explaining that operators needed to trust they could work undercover without facing assault from the very personnel whose operations they supported. He described Whisper's reputation within Special Operations Forces and the respect she'd earned through performance that Brennan had never bothered to verify before grabbing her. His testimony emphasized that the services couldn't afford to lose talented operators because people like Brennan couldn't recognize capability when it didn't match their preconceptions about what operators looked like. The defense presented mitigation evidence about Brennan's family circumstances, his prior service, and the impact discharge would have on his future. Character witnesses described positive aspects of his leadership and instances where he performed well. The testimony aimed to humanize Brennan and encourage the panel to consider that one catastrophic mistake shouldn't define an entire career. But the prosecution's response highlighted that Brennan's assault wasn't a single momentary lapse, but reflected deeper prejudices that had influenced his decision-making at multiple points, where he could have chosen differently and avoided the outcome. The panel deliberated on sentencing for 4 hours, longer than their guilt deliberation, but still relatively brief given the severity of charges and the multiple factors they needed to consider. When they returned, the sentence included reduction to private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, confinement for 18 months, and bad conduct discharge. The sentence reflected both the seriousness of assaulting a special operations operator and the gender-based discrimination that had motivated his actions. The panel's accompanying statement emphasized that personnel who couldn't treat all service members with appropriate respect and who violated security protocols through assumption-based judgments had no place in military service. Brennan received the sentence without visible reaction, the weight of consequences he'd anticipated for weeks finally becoming official reality. His military career ended in the courtroom, where the panel's findings confirmed what everyone who'd seen the video evidence already knew: that he'd assaulted someone whose capabilities exceeded his own and whose professionalism in response had demonstrated exactly the kind of discipline he'd lacked when he grabbed her arm without bothering to verify who she was or whether his assumptions had any basis in reality. Word of the court-martial outcome spread through special operations communities before official notifications reached conventional commands. The informal networks that connected operators across services and theaters carrying news that accountability had been delivered for assaulting one of their own. Rodriguez received messages from SEAL teammates who'd worked with Whisper over the years, their responses ranging from satisfaction that justice had been served to ongoing anger that she'd faced assault in the first place. The sentence sent the message they'd wanted, that putting hands on classified operators without justification carried career-ending consequences severe enough to deter anyone tempted to make similar mistakes. Master Chief Ramirez used the court-martial outcome as a teaching point in conversations with junior operators, explaining how Brennan's assumptions had blinded him to reality and cost him everything he'd built over 2 decades of service. The lesson extended beyond gender dynamics to the fundamental principle that capability couldn't be determined by appearance and that verification protocols existed for reasons Brennan had learned too late. Ramirez emphasized that elite operators needed to recognize excellence regardless of how it presented, that failure to do so represented professional incompetence as dangerous as any technical skill deficiency. Hayes and Morrison briefed Force Recon leadership on the outcome and the policy changes it had generated. Their report highlighted that while Brennan's punishment provided appropriate accountability, the more significant impact came from institutional reforms at multiple command levels. The enhanced protocols for protecting operators' undercover assignments, the improved verification procedures, and the command climate changes all represented systemic improvements that would outlast any individual case. Force Recon incorporated lessons from Whisper's experience into training curricula, ensuring future operators understood both their rights when challenged and the resources available if they faced misconduct. Patterson received notification of the sentence with mixed feelings, satisfied that appropriate consequences had been delivered while remaining troubled by the command failures that had allowed the incident to occur. He continued implementing the climate changes he'd committed to, using Brennan's case in leadership training as an example of how assumptions and inadequate verification created catastrophic outcomes. The training resonated differently after the court-martial conclusion, carrying weight that came from documented consequences rather than theoretical warnings. Personnel who'd wondered whether the command's response represented temporary attention found that Patterson sustained his focus on climate issues, making clear the changes were permanent rather than incident-driven. Grant completed his final investigation report, documenting not just Brennan's assault and conviction, but the broader institutional lessons about protecting special operations personnel, addressing gender bias in military environments, and ensuring verification protocols functioned effectively across different command structures. His report went to senior leaders across multiple services, becoming part of policy discussions about how special operations forces manage personnel and cover assignments, and how conventional commands created environments where all personnel receive treatment based on capability rather than characteristics irrelevant to performance. The report included specific recommendations that several commands adopted formally. Notification procedures for base commanders when classified personnel operated undercover on their installations, providing minimal awareness without compromising operational security. Enhanced training on verification protocols that emphasize the requirement to confirm authorization before physical contact or detention. Climate assessment tools specifically designed to identify gender-based differential treatment before it manifested in serious misconduct. Each recommendation emerged from analyzing what had failed in Whisper's case and what systemic changes would prevent similar failures. Brennan began serving his confinement at a military correctional facility, the reality of his 18-month sentence settling into routine that would define his immediate future. He had time to reflect on every decision point where he could have chosen differently, every moment where verification would have revealed his mistake before assault occurred. The knowledge that Whisper had continued her mission professionally despite what he'd done to her, that she'd provided testimony without evident anger or vindictiveness, somehow made a situation feel worse than if she'd shown the satisfaction of seeing him punished. Her professional detachment demonstrated the gap between them more effectively than any emotional response could have. Other personnel who'd witnessed the original incident processed the court-martial outcome according to their own perspectives. Marines who'd felt uncomfortable watching Brennan grab Whisper found validation that their instincts about the situation had been correct, that something had indeed been wrong about what they'd observed. Personnel who'd shared Brennan's assumptions about female capabilities faced uncomfortable recognition that their own attitudes might lead to similar consequences if acted upon without better judgment. The outcome created conversations across the base about respect, verification, and the professional obligation to treat all personnel appropriately regardless of personal opinions about their capabilities. Several female personnel who'd filed the previous conduct complaints that Grant's investigation had uncovered reported feeling more confident that future issues would receive serious attention. The visible accountability Brennan faced, combined with Patterson's sustained focus on climate, created evidence that reporting mechanisms might actually function effectively rather than resulting in minimal consequences and potential retaliation. The cultural shift remained incomplete, but the trajectory suggested genuine change rather than performative responses that would fade once attention moved elsewhere. Rodriguez received notification that he'd been selected to brief other SEAL teams about the incident and its lessons during their pre-deployment training cycles. The assignment reflected SEAL Command's determination to ensure the community understood how to recognize and respond when operators face misconduct, whether from adversaries or from friendly forces whose assumptions created security vulnerabilities. Rodriguez developed his briefing with emphasis on the professional judgment required to balance protecting personnel with allowing situations to develop in ways that created institutional accountability rather than just immediate tactical resolution. Whisper, operating in her new assignment under different cover, received official notification of the court-martial outcome through secure channels. Her response was characteristically brief acknowledgement that appropriate consequences had been delivered and that she appreciated the institutional reforms the incident had generated. She asked for no additional information about Brennan's status or circumstances, maintaining the professional distance that had defined her approach throughout. Her focus remained on current operations rather than past incidents, compartmentalizing effectively in ways that allowed her to maintain peak effectiveness regardless of complications that had occurred in previous assignments. The wider military community gradually learned of the case through official channels that released sanitized versions, protecting operational security while establishing precedent about unacceptable conduct. JAG briefers used the case in training about assault, security protocols, and the intersection of operational requirements with personnel protection. The instruction emphasized that special operations personnel deserved the same protection from assault as any service member, that their cover status didn't diminish their rights, and that verification procedures existed specifically to prevent the kind of assumption-based misconduct Brennan had committed. Patterson continued his quarterly climate assessments as committed, finding gradual but measurable improvements in how personnel reported feeling respected and how they perceived command responsiveness to conduct concerns. The metrics suggested that sustained leadership attention created culture change, though Patterson recognized the work would require ongoing effort rather than one-time fixes. He shared his base's experience with other commanders through professional networks, contributing to broader discussions about climate management and the specific challenges of creating environments where diverse personnel felt valued and protected. 3 months after the court-martial, Grant conducted follow-up assessments with commands that had implemented his recommendations, evaluating whether the policy changes produced intended effects or required adjustment. His findings indicated that most recommendations have been adopted effectively, though some commands struggled with balancing notification requirements against operational security concerns. Grant worked with those commands to develop nuanced approaches that satisfied both objectives, acknowledging that perfect solutions didn't exist, but meaningful improvement remained achievable through thoughtful implementation and willingness to adapt based on feedback. Hawkins coordinated with other SEAL commanders to ensure the community maintained its protective stance toward operators like Whisper, while also fostering relationships with conventional forces built on mutual respect rather than insular separation. The balance required recognizing that most personnel wanted to do right, but needed education about special operations dynamics, that Brennan represented failure rather than norm, and that collaborative relationships served mission effectiveness better than defensive separation. The approach aimed to create environments where operators could work effectively undercover, while conventional commands understood their responsibility to protect all personnel regardless of assignment classification. Hayes and Morrison tracked how Force Recon operators in cover assignments experienced their environments post-incident, finding general improvement in how conventional commands handled authorization questions and how personnel reported feeling when challenged about their presence or activities. The improvements weren't universal, but the trajectory suggested institutional learning had occurred and that Whisper's experience had catalyzed meaningful change rather than temporary attention that faded without lasting impact. They continued gathering feedback for ongoing policy refinement, recognizing that protecting operators required sustained effort rather than one-time intervention. The special operations community's informal networks continued discussing the case months after the court-martial, the story becoming part of shared culture about what right looked like in terms of professional conduct and what consequences followed when people failed to meet appropriate standards. Whisper's name rarely appeared in those discussions, the focus remaining on principles rather than individuals. But operators who'd worked with her knew the case involved someone they respected and whose handling of the situation exemplified the discipline they valued. The discussions reinforced community standards about recognizing capability regardless of appearance and about the obligation to protect operators whose work required them to operate undercover among personnel who might not recognize their actual status. 6 months after the court-martial, Brennan approached the midpoint of his confinement with time to reflect on how completely his assumptions had destroyed the career he'd spent 2 decades building. The correctional facility routine gave him structure, but no escape from recognizing that every day of confinement traced back to decisions he'd made in minutes. Grabbing someone without verification because his prejudices told him she couldn't possibly be someone who deserved proper protocol. Other inmates knew generally what he'd done. Word spreading through facility networks that he'd assaulted a special operations officer, though the classified details remained protected even in conversations among prisoners. His family visited occasionally, their support strained by the reality that his actions had cost them stability and status they'd enjoyed through his military career. His wife asked questions he couldn't fully answer about why he'd made the choices that led here, and his attempts to explain how his assumptions had blinded him to reality sounded inadequate even to himself. His children's confusion about why their father was in prison and what would happen after his release created pressure that added to consequences he faced daily. The discharge that would follow confinement meant starting over in civilian life with a record that would complicate employment, housing, and every aspect of reintegration. Patterson's base continued implementing the climate reforms that Brennan's case had catalyzed, the changes becoming embedded in standard operations rather than special initiatives requiring constant attention. Quarterly assessments showed sustained improvement in how personnel experienced the environment, with particular progress in areas related to gender dynamics and professional respect. Several junior female personnel reported feeling more confident bringing forward concerns, citing the visible accountability in Brennan's case as evidence that reporting mechanisms functioned effectively. Patterson shared his metrics with other commanders through professional forums, contributing to broader discussions about climate management and the specific approaches that produced measurable results. New personnel arriving at the base received orientation that included training on the incident without identifying Brennan by name, using the case as illustration of how assumption-based judgments created catastrophic outcomes and violated both security protocols and basic professional standards. The training emphasized verification procedures, appropriate conduct toward all personnel regardless of gender or apparent rank, and the consequences that followed when people prioritized assumptions over proper protocols. Instructors noted that the base had learned expensive lessons from the case and expected all personnel to internalize those lessons without requiring additional incidents to reinforce their importance. Rodriguez completed his assignment briefing SEAL teams about the incident and its lessons, his presentations reaching hundreds of operators across multiple theaters. The briefings emphasized the professional obligation to recognize capability regardless of appearance, the importance of protecting operators who worked undercover, and the balance between intervention and allowing accountability through proper channels. Rodriguez used Whisper's response to Brennan's assault as example of operational discipline under adverse circumstances, highlighting how she maintained mission focus despite personal impact and had enabled systemic reforms through her professional handling of the situation. The SEAL community incorporated Rodriguez's lessons into standard training curricula, ensuring new operators understood these dynamics from the beginning of their careers rather than learning through experience or observation. The instruction covered not just the Brennan case specifically, but the broader principles about professional conduct, verification requirements, and the obligation to create environments where operators could work effectively regardless of assignment structure or cover requirements. Master Chief Ramirez noted that the training produced measurable changes in how young SEALs thought about these issues, developing awareness earlier in their careers that previous generations had acquired gradually, if at all. Hayes and Morrison tracked force recon operators and cover assignments through anonymous feedback mechanisms that protected operational security while gathering data about their experiences. The feedback indicated general improvement in how conventional commands handled authorization questions and how personnel responded when operators appeared in unexpected locations or conducted activities that seemed unusual without context. The improvements weren't universal, but enough positive change had occurred that operators reported feeling better protected and more confident that misconduct would face serious consequences rather than dismissal or minimization. Grant's policy recommendations produced formal changes across multiple commands, each revision reflecting lessons from analyzing what had failed in Whisper's case. Theater-level security protocols now included specific provisions for protecting classified personnel operating undercover, with verification procedures that balanced operational security against commander awareness. Training requirements expanded to include instruction on gender dynamics and assumption-based judgment risks. Reporting mechanisms received standardization that ensured conduct complaints received appropriate attention regardless of whether they involved classified personnel or conventional forces members. The Department of Defense incorporated the case into broader policy discussions about sexual assault prevention and response, recognizing that Brennan's gender-based assault on Whisper represented issues the services needed to address through multiple interconnected approaches. Legislative testimony referenced the case when discussing the importance of commander accountability for climate, the need for enhanced training on professional conduct, and a requirement for serious consequences when personnel violated standards regardless of justifications offered. The testimony used sanitized versions that protected operational details while establishing the incident's significance for policy development. Whisper's current assignment placed her in a different theater under new cover identity, her work continuing with the effectiveness that had characterized her entire career. Personnel in her new environment had no knowledge of the previous incident, treating her according to whatever impressions her cover identity created without awareness of her actual capabilities or history. She navigated those dynamics with practiced ease, maintaining operational security while accomplishing assigned objectives without requiring recognition or acknowledgement from people whose opinions didn't affect her professional assessment of herself or her mission value. Hawkins received notification that Whisper had been recommended for promotion based on her operational record and the professional manner in which she'd handled the assault and subsequent investigation. The promotion would occur through classified channels that protected her actual assignment, while advancing her career appropriately. Hawkins endorsed the recommendation enthusiastically, noting in his evaluation that few operators demonstrated her combination of technical excellence, operational discipline, and grace under circumstances that would have derailed less capable personnel. His endorsement emphasized that her response to Brennan's assault had exemplified everything the services should value in special operations personnel. Patterson implemented a mentorship program pairing senior female personnel with junior women entering technical or operational roles, creating support structures that helped newer personnel navigate dynamics experienced operators understood from years of service. The program emerged from recognizing that Whisper's professional handling of Brennan's assault reflected skills and resilience developed over time, capabilities that could be fostered in others through deliberate mentorship and community building. Initial feedback suggested the program met real needs, with participants reporting increased confidence and better strategies for addressing subtle challenges they faced in male-dominated career fields. Several commanders who'd reviewed Grant's report contacted Patterson to learn more about his climate improvement approaches, creating informal networks for sharing best practices and troubleshooting implementation challenges. The conversations revealed that many bases struggled with similar issues Brennan's case had exposed, that assumption-based judgments and inadequate verification procedures existed widely rather than representing unique failures at Patterson's command. The networking produced collaborative learning that accelerated climate improvements across multiple installations, multiplying the impact of lessons learned from one incident into broader institutional change. The JAG Corps continued using the case in training about intersection of operational security, personnel protection, and criminal prosecution under military justice. New JAG officers learned how to balance classified testimony against defendant rights, how to present evidence in cases involving special operations personnel, and how to ensure accountability proceeded effectively despite complexities that might tempt commands to minimize incidents for operational convenience. The instruction emphasized that protecting missions didn't require tolerating misconduct, that operators deserve the same justice as any service member, and that proper handling of such cases strengthened, rather than compromised, operational effectiveness. Brennan's confinement continued its routine progression toward eventual release, each day bringing him closer to discharge and civilian reintegration, while providing no relief from knowledge that his assumptions had cost him everything. He participated in educational programs the facility offered, preparing for employment searches he knew would be complicated by his record. Counselors asked what he'd learned from his experience, and his answers demonstrated understanding that came too late to change outcomes. He could articulate now how gender bias had affected his judgment, how verification protocols existed for reasons he'd ignored, and how professional respect should apply regardless of personal opinions about capability or appearance. His articulation of those lessons provided no satisfaction to the people he'd harmed or the institution he'd failed. The understanding he'd developed through consequence served primarily as evidence that the court-martial sentence had been appropriate, that accountability mechanisms functioned as designed when people violated standards through conduct as egregious as his assault on Whisper. The special operations community took no pleasure in his punishment, but maintained consistent position that his fate represented appropriate outcome for putting hands on an operator without justification, that the severity of consequences matched the seriousness of his misconduct and sent necessary messages to anyone tempted towards similar actions. 1 year after the initial incident, Grant conducted comprehensive assessment of the institutional changes his investigation had catalyzed, evaluating whether reforms had produced sustained improvements or represented temporary responses that faded once attention moved elsewhere. His evaluation examined multiple metrics including climate survey data, conduct complaint patterns, verification protocol compliance, and feedback from special operations personnel working undercover assignments. The results showed measurable progress across most indicators, with particular improvement in areas directly related to gender dynamics and professional respect for personnel whose capabilities didn't match conventional expectations about what operators looked like. The assessment revealed that commands which had embraced reforms most thoroughly showed the strongest results, while installations that had implemented changes minimally or treated them as compliance exercises rather than genuine culture work showed limited improvement. Grant's report highlighted this pattern as evidence that leadership commitment determined effectiveness more than any specific policy design, that commanders who genuinely prioritized climate created better environments than those who viewed reforms as administrative burdens imposed from above. The finding reinforced emphasis on leadership development and commander accountability for culture outcomes rather than just technical compliance with directives. Patterson's base appeared prominently in Grant's positive examples. The sustained improvements documented through multiple assessment cycles demonstrating what committed leadership could achieve. Patterson had maintained his focus on climate issues long after the immediate attention for Brennan's case faded. treating the reforms as permanent operational requirements rather than temporary initiatives. His approach included regular engagement with personnel at all levels, visible consequences when conduct standards were violated, and willingness to acknowledge ongoing challenges rather than claiming problems have been solved. The combination produced an environment where personnel reported feeling respected and confident that concerns would receive serious attention. Several female special operations personnel provided confidential feedback to Grant about their experiences working undercover in the years since Whisper's assault, their perspectives offering direct evidence about whether reforms had improved operator safety and effectiveness. The feedback indicated general improvement, but also identified continuing vulnerabilities, particularly in commands that hadn't fully implemented verification protocols or where leadership treated gender dynamics as resolved issues rather than requiring ongoing attention. The operators appreciated enhanced reporting mechanisms and felt more confident that serious misconduct would face consequences, though several noted that subtle dismissals and assumption-based judgments persisted in ways that created operational friction without rising to assault level. Whisper contributed to Grant's assessment through classified channels that protected her current assignment, her feedback reflecting the unique perspective of someone who'd experienced assault, continued missions successfully despite it, and now worked in environments shaped partly by reforms her case had generated. She noted that institutional changes had been meaningful but incomplete, that protocols worked better when leadership enforced them consistently rather than treating them as suggestions, and that culture change required sustained effort across multiple command levels rather than one-time training or policy updates. Her assessment was characteristically pragmatic, acknowledging progress while identifying areas needing continued attention. Brennan completed his confinement and received his bad conduct discharge, the administrative processing that ended his military service carrying finality that marked complete severance from the career that had defined his adult life. He departed the correctional facility with minimal belongings and a record that would complicate every aspect of civilian reintegration. The discharge certificate documented his conviction and sentence, information that would appear in background checks and employment applications, creating obstacles he'd face repeatedly while trying to rebuild some version of normal life. Veteran service organizations offered limited assistance given the nature of his discharge, their support constrained by the serious misconduct that had ended his career. His attempts to find employment revealed how thoroughly his assault conviction affected civilian opportunities. Employers who might have overlooked minor infractions or technical violations responded differently to someone who'd physically grabbed and detained a woman based on gender-based assumptions. The nature of his offense carried implications that extended beyond military context into civilian concerns about workplace conduct and professional judgment. He worked temporary positions that didn't require extensive background checks, accepting whatever employment he could find while recognizing his options would remain limited indefinitely due to choices he'd made in moments he couldn't reverse. Rodriguez attended a reunion of SEAL personnel who deployed together over previous years, the gathering including multiple operators who'd worked with Whisper on various missions. Conversations inevitably touched on Brennan's case, the consensus among assembled SEALs being that appropriate accountability had been delivered and that institutional reforms represented meaningful progress. Several operators shared experiences from their own recent deployments where they'd observed improved climate and better adherence to verification protocols, attributing some of that improvement to heightened awareness following Whisper's case. The discussions reflected community commitment to protecting operators like her, while also fostering relationships with conventional forces built on mutual respect rather than defensive separation. Master Chief Ramirez marked his upcoming retirement by conducting final mentorship sessions with junior SEALs, his lessons drawn from 3 decades of special operations experience, including the year spent addressing fallout from Brennan's assault. He emphasized that elite operators needed to recognize excellence regardless of how it presented, that failure to do so represented professional incompetence as dangerous as any technical deficiency. Ramirez told the young SEALs that Whisper's case had become part of community culture specifically because it illustrated what right looked like in terms of professional discipline under adverse circumstances and what consequences followed when people failed basic standards of conduct and judgment. Hayes and Morrison completed their multi-year analysis of force recon operator experiences undercover assignments. Their report documenting how Whisper's case had affected both policy and practice across commands where operators worked alongside conventional forces. The analysis showed that verification protocols functioned more effectively when commanders understood they served dual purposes of operational security and personnel protection. That training needed regular reinforcement rather than one-time instruction, and that leadership commitment remained the single most important factor determining whether reforms produced intended effects. Their recommendations for future policy development emphasized sustained attention rather than incident-driven responses that faded over time. Patterson prepared to transfer to new assignment, his tenure at the base ending with satisfaction that he'd responded to Brennan's assault by implementing lasting changes rather than temporary fixes. His replacement received extensive briefing on climate initiatives and their history, Patterson emphasizing the importance of sustaining reforms rather than allowing them to atrophy under new leadership. The transition planning included mechanisms for measuring continued progress, ensuring accountability systems remained functional, and maintaining the commander engagement that had proven essential for creating genuine culture change. Patterson's final climate assessment showed sustained improvement across all measured areas, providing baseline for his successor to maintain and build upon. Grant received assignment to develop theater-wide training program based on lessons learned from Brennan's case and the year of institutional response it had generated. The assignment reflected recognition that his investigation had produced insights valuable beyond the specific incident. That broader application of those lessons could prevent similar failures across multiple commands. Grant approached the training development with focus on making abstract principles concrete through realistic scenarios, helping personnel understand how assumption-based judgments created risks and how proper protocols protected both individuals and operations. The curriculum would reach thousands of service members over coming years, multiplying the impact of one incident into sustained institutional learning. Hawkins assumed broader responsibilities within SEAL Command that included oversight of policies affecting operators in cover assignments across all theaters. His new role gave him authority to implement some of the systemic improvements that had emerged from analyzing Whisper's case, particularly regarding notification procedures and verification protocols. Hawkins worked with commanders across services to develop standardized approaches that balanced operational security against personnel protection, creating frameworks that respected mission requirements while ensuring operators didn't face assault from personnel who should have been allies rather than threats. The collaborative approach produced solutions more effective than any single service could have developed independently. Whisper received her promotion through classified channels, the advancement recognizing both her operational excellence and her professional handling of circumstances that would have compromised less capable personnel. The promotion came with new assignment that leveraged her experience and skills in ways that benefited from institutional reforms her case had catalyzed. She continued working undercover as missions required, her interactions with conventional forces personnel now occurring within environments shaped partly by lessons learned from Brennan's assault. The environment wasn't perfect, assumptions and dismissals still occurred, but protocols existed now that hadn't before, protections that reduced likelihood of misconduct escalating to assault and increased confidence that serious violations would face meaningful consequences. The Special Operations community marked the first anniversary of Brennan's conviction with informal acknowledgement that appropriate accountability had been delivered and that institutional response had produced meaningful change. The acknowledgement wasn't celebration, but recognition that justice had functioned as designed, that an operator who'd been assaulted had received support and vindication, and that systems had adapted to reduce vulnerability for personnel who would face similar dynamics in future assignments. The community maintained protective stance toward operators like Whisper while also expressing satisfaction that Brennan's fate demonstrated clear consequences for putting hands on people without justification or proper verification. 2 years after Brennan grabbed Whisper's arm without verification, the institutional changes his assault had catalyzed had become embedded in standard operations across multiple commands, no longer requiring special attention or initiative-specific focus. The reforms existed as baseline expectations rather than progressive improvements, integrated into how personnel were trained, how commanders were evaluated, and how the services approached professional conduct and operational security for classified personnel. The transformation from crisis response to standard practice represented exactly the kind of sustained change that distinguished genuine institutional learning from temporary reactions that faded once immediate attention moved elsewhere. Patterson's successor at the base maintained and expanded the climate initiatives, treating them as inherited responsibilities rather than optional programs. The quarterly assessments showed continued improvement, with newer personnel reporting they'd never experienced the kind of environment that had enabled Brennan's assumptions and assault. For them, verification protocols and professional respect standards represented normal operating procedures rather than reforms implemented in response to failures. That generational shift in baseline expectations represented perhaps the most significant measure of lasting change, evidence that the institution had learned lessons that would persist beyond the individuals who'd experienced the original incident. Grant's theater-wide training program reached its second year of implementation, having educated thousands of service members about assumption-based judgment risks, verification protocols, and the consequences that followed when personnel prioritized prejudices over proper procedures. Feedback indicated the training changed attitudes and behaviors measurably, with commanders reporting fewer conduct complaints and enhanced awareness of dynamics the training addressed. Grant continued refining the curriculum based on experience, adding scenarios that reflected new challenges while maintaining focus on fundamental principles about professional respect and operational security that transcended specific situations. Brennan worked civilian job in logistics, his position utilizing skills from his military career while accommodating the limitations his discharge imposed. He'd found employer willing to hire him despite his record, though the opportunity came with understanding that trust needed rebuilding and that his past would remain relevant to his professional prospects. He participated in veteran support groups for personnel struggling with reintegration, his story serving as cautionary example about how poor judgment could destroy careers and complicate civilian transition. His contributions to those discussions showed genuine understanding of his failures, though that understanding provided limited comfort to the people he'd harmed or the career he'd lost. His family had adapted to their changed circumstances, relationships strained but not completely severed by consequences of his choices. His children asked fewer questions now about why he'd been in prison, their understanding growing as they aged, though full comprehension of gender bias and institutional failures remained beyond their developmental capacity. His wife maintained employment that provided stability their household needed, her resilience carrying them through difficulties his assault conviction had created. They existed a new normal defined by his mistakes, managing rather than thriving, accepting reality they couldn't change regardless of regrets he expressed. Rodriguez received orders to instructor duty where he'd train new SEAL candidates. His assignment, including responsibility for teaching professional conduct and judgment lessons drawn from his career experience. He planned to incorporate Whisper's case into his instruction, using the incident to help young operators understand how assumptions undermined effectiveness and how proper verification protected both personnel and missions. Rodriguez maintained contact with Whisper through secure channels, their professional relationship continuing across assignments that took them to different theaters but kept them connected through the community of operators who'd worked together under challenging circumstances. Master Chief Ramirez settled into retirement with satisfaction that his final years of active service had contributed to institutional improvements that would outlast his career. He remained connected to the SEAL community through informal networks, his perspective sought by active operators and commanders who valued his experience and judgment. When asked about significant cases or incidents from his career, he often mentioned Whisper's assault and the response it generated, emphasizing both the injustice of what Brennan had done and the professionalism with which she'd handled circumstances that could have compromised lesser operators. His storytelling ensured lessons from the incident remained part of community culture rather than fading as personnel rotated and memories dimmed. Hayes and Morrison continued their force recon careers with enhanced responsibilities that included oversight of operator welfare and effectiveness across cover assignments. Their sustained attention to issues Whisper's case had highlighted ensured Force Recon maintained focus on protecting personnel who worked under conditions that created unique vulnerabilities. They collaborated with counterparts across services to develop standardized best practices. They were producing frameworks that balanced operational requirements against personnel protection in ways that served both objectives effectively. The collaborative approach reflected recognition that special operations forces faced shared challenges requiring coordinated solutions rather than service-specific responses. Hawkins implemented comprehensive reforms within SEAL Command regarding how operators and cover assignments were supported and protected, his policies reflecting lessons learned from analyzing what had failed in Whisper's case and what systemic changes prevented similar failures. The reforms included enhanced notification procedures, improved verification protocols, and regular assessment of operator experiences to identify emerging challenges before they manifested in serious incidents. Hawkins emphasized to commanders that protecting operators represented command responsibility as fundamental as mission planning or resource allocation, that personnel security couldn't be sacrificed for operational convenience or administrative efficiency. Whisper operated in her third theater since the incident, her work continuing with effectiveness that validated every institutional investment in her development and every reform implemented to protect operators like her. She completed multiple successful missions under different cover identities, her professional record reflecting sustained excellence despite complications that would have derailed personnel without her discipline and resilience. The promotions and recognition she'd received remained classified, known only to those with operational need to know, exactly the kind of acknowledgement that mattered to her more than public acclaim or visible awards that would compromise her effectiveness in roles requiring anonymity. After everything that happened, think about the people you work with and the assumptions you make about their capabilities. Drop a comment telling us about a time you discovered someone's true abilities after underestimating them, or when you saw someone face judgment based on appearance rather than performance. We all have something to learn about not judging by first impressions and giving people opportunity to show who they really are. The institutional memory of Brennan's assault remained strong enough that new personnel learned about it through training and informal mentorship, the case becoming part of service culture about what wrong looked like and what consequences followed. The memory served preventive function, reminding personnel that assumption-based judgments carried risks beyond just being incorrect, that acting on prejudices without verification could destroy careers and harm people who deserved better treatment. The case had become a teaching tool precisely because it illustrated principles clearly, demonstrating through documented consequences what happened when people prioritized assumptions over protocols. Grant received assignment to Joint Staff position where his expertise in special operations policy and personnel protection issues contributed to developing Department of Defense-wide guidance. His work influenced policies across all services, spreading lessons from Whisper's case into frameworks that would protect thousands of operators over coming decades. The assignment represented recognition that his investigation and subsequent reform efforts had produced insights valuable at strategic level, that individual incident response had revealed systemic issues requiring attention beyond theater or service-specific contexts. Grant approached the work with commitment to ensuring institutional learning translated into sustained improvement rather than temporary compliance. Patterson advanced to more senior command with reputation as leader who'd responded to crisis by implementing genuine culture change rather than defensive minimization. His handling of Brennan's case appeared in his performance evaluations and promotion recommendations, cited as example of taking responsibility for climate while ensuring appropriate accountability for individual misconduct. Other commanders sought his perspective on managing similar challenges, his experience providing practical guidance about translating good intentions into measurable outcomes. Patterson shared lessons freely, emphasizing that sustained improvement required leadership commitment beyond initial reactions and willingness to maintain focus after immediate attention faded. The special operations community maintained its protective stance toward operators who worked undercover, the heightened awareness following Whisper's assault persisting as operational standard rather than temporary vigilance. Operators knew they had support from their communities if they faced misconduct, that reporting mechanisms functioned effectively, and that consequences would follow when personnel violated standards regardless of justifications offered. The confidence that protection existed enabled operators to focus on missions rather than managing interpersonal dynamics defensively, enhancing effectiveness while reducing stress that came from navigating hostile or dismissive environments without institutional backing. Whisper continued her career with focus on operational excellence rather than on the incident that had catalyzed institutional changes. She rarely discussed Brennan's assault, even in secure contexts where classification allowed, her attention directed toward current missions and future assignments rather than past complications. Her professional assessment remained that appropriate accountability had been delivered and meaningful reforms had been implemented, making the incident valuable primarily for lessons it generated rather than for personal vindication it provided. That perspective reflected the mindset that made her effective as operator, the ability to compartmentalize disruptions and maintain focus on objectives that mattered strategically rather than personally. The lasting impact of Brennan's assault extended far beyond the individuals directly involved, touching thousands of service members through training, policy changes, and cultural shifts that emerged from institutional response to one staff sergeant's catastrophic judgment failure. He'd grabbed someone without verification because his assumptions told him she couldn't possibly be someone who deserved proper protocols. That choice had cost him everything while catalyzing reforms that protected operators he'd never know and prevented incidents that would never occur because people learned lessons from his mistakes. The transformation of his failure into institutional improvement represented exactly how military organizations should respond to serious misconduct, holding individuals accountable while addressing systemic factors that enabled or failed to prevent their actions. Whisper's story became legend within special operations circles, told to new operators as illustration of professional discipline under adverse circumstances and as a reminder that capability often presented in ways that defied conventional expectations. The operators who knew her actual identity rarely used her name in those discussions, protecting her ongoing effectiveness by keeping focus on principles rather than individuals. But they knew, and she knew, that her response to being assaulted had demonstrated character as valuable as any technical skill, resilience that defined elite operators as surely as marksmanship or tactical judgment. That recognition mattered more than any public acknowledgement could have, validation from peers who understood what she'd faced and how extraordinarily well she'd handled it. 2 years after the incident, Brennan's name was mentioned primarily in cautionary contexts, his case referenced in training about what not to do rather than in discussion of professional excellence. His legacy was the negative example, the failure that taught through consequence, the career destroyed by assumptions that overrode verification. That legacy served purpose even if it brought him no satisfaction, preventing unknown number of similar incidents by making clear what happened when people grabbed operators without bothering to learn who they were grabbing. The services had learned from his mistake at his expense, exactly the kind of accountability that protected future personnel from facing what Whisper had endured because one staff sergeant couldn't see past his prejudices long enough to ask questions before putting his hands on someone.